Hello, everyone. Hey, sorry about last minute. Again, the family left, so I got my chance to stream, and we're just gonna do it. Not exactly ready, but nonetheless, this is a good topic, and I wanted to go over this with everybody because I keep seeing this being brought up in arguments against young Earth creation, and I'm going to show you guys just how easy it is to refute this argument. And this comes with ice core dating. Now, many of you probably heard about it before. It's not as simple as really just digging into the ground, pulling up ice in a tube-like cylinder, and then counting the rings. That's kind of what they do. That's what they used to do when they started. But then they realized there's a lot of assumptions involved, right? Like these are annual rings. Well, things weren't lining up with annual rings, meaning when they knew that it was a volcanic eruption and they counted the rings back every year, they weren't landing on when the volcano supposedly erupted. So they said, maybe these annual rings aren't rings. So what they do now is they calibrate it. Shocker, I know. And by this calibration, what I mean is that they now take those rings and they calibrate them to radiometric dating, and they calibrate them to ash content that may be found in there, debris, and a couple other things. So essentially what they've done is they've taken the rudimentary easy version with the assumption that each ring that they see is hot and cold, winter, summer, and they've extrapolated that back into now radiometric dating. So I'm going to show you guys a quick video. And in this video, there's a lot to unpack. So I might pause it once. I'll try my hardest not to. And then we'll move on to a short presentation that I gathered for everybody. So I hope you all can hear it because I'm going to use my microphone to relay this info. So I'm going to turn it up just a little. Close the door. And here we go.
In 1942, during the Second World War, an American Lockheed P-38 Lightning had to make an emergency landing on the island. The crew was rescued, but the plane was left behind where it landed and became lost to time. Half a century later, in 1992, after years of searching for it, a team finally rediscovered the long-lost airplane that was by then buried beneath 268 feet of ice from the past 50 years of cumulative snowfall. The plane was later restored and even returned back to flying condition and took to the skies once again after being buried for the previous half a century, hidden beneath the ice of Greenland. It would ultimately end up becoming only one of many American artifacts lost to the ice here for some time. In 1968, an American bomber carrying 4 thermonuclear bombs caught fire midair and crashed on Greenland around here. An extensive cleanup operation was subsequently carried out by both the United States and Denmark, and nearly all of the parts coming from the plane and the nuclear weapons were discovered, except for one puzzling and potentially troubling piece: the secondary stage cylinder from one of the nuclear bombs, carrying uranium and lithium deuteride. Essentially the piece that carries the nuclear fuel for one of the bombs. A pretty small component, no larger than a beer keg. This component was never discovered by the cleanup operation and likely remains buried and hidden beneath hundreds of feet of ice somewhere around that area to this day. And then, just a decade ago.
So there we have it. Okay, it's called the Lost Squadron. Now, a lot's been written on this, but as you've noticed, it's under 200 feet of snow, and it only took 50 years for that to happen. Now, that brings the question and a paradox into the reality of ice core dating. They never expected that to happen because they've expected uniformitarianism. That is, the present of today is the key to the past. They believe this, right? So how can we see a plane going down 50 years ago under multiple layers, right? That literally, when you count the layers, there's over 100,000 of them. This makes no logical sense, right? It's because they don't believe, or I should say, they believe that the rings are warm cold, and they are, but they believe they're annual rings because they only believe that it gets warm enough to create a ring during the hottest days of summer and then the coldest days of winter. That's where they're wrong. The fluctuations can happen in temperature in a day, As you know, you wake up in the morning, it's cold. Later in the day, it gets warm. Then a storm can blow in. It can rain. It can snow. Tropical winds blow in from the ocean. The current can bring fluctuations of temperature. There's so many different variables. So when they do these ice core layerings on this island, you're going to find now the problems that they have. And I broke all of this down. So I'm sorry I'm doing this during the marathon that I created on Standing for Truth's channel. And I know most people are there watching, but you guys can come to this later at any time. So I'm going to read through and how I broke all of this down for everybody. So the first one is I've highlighted all the areas in pink. I will read them off for those of you that are just listening like it's a radio show. But here are the highlights. Okay. For the purpose of this article, we will ignore the arguments and say that from sometime within the 13th and 14th century, it got significantly colder in the northern hemisphere, mainly in the North Atlantic regions for centuries. A previous study based on insect life in Greenland, flies specifically, support the theory that when Vikings came around in the year 985, the weather was pretty wonderful by the standards of the Arctic environments. And then the Little Ice Age is an oddly controversial period that was not a global ice age, but a protracted cold period followed by anomalous medieval warming periods. And I gotta shrink it a little bit to read the last line. Around 500 years of warm weather, the Little Ice Age descended. Okay, so this is the reason I read this off is because we have now a time frame, right? We see between the 13th and 14th century, it got significantly colder, but then around 985, when the Vikings got there, there was no ice. It was warm. So that gives us another date. And then they say at the bottom, another date around 500 years of warm weather. So we have a period of how long it stayed warm. All of this is important, trust me. In the next article, I found Viking led by Eric the Red. He first sailed and discovered the island in Greenland in 985, according to Icelandic records. And then the colonies disappeared around 1360 and 1460. So now we have the duration of how long they were there. The Vikings occupied the Greenland. That did coincide with the medieval warming period. Their disappearance did follow the onset of the Little Ice Age, which ran from 1850. So again, more times. Now here's another really good one. This is also important. Scientists were stunned to discover the plants beneath a mile deep of Greenland ice. This is huge. This is important. So in 1966, the United States Army scientists drilled down through nearly a mile of ice in northwestern Greenland and pulled up a 15-foot long tube of dirt from the bottom. So a mile down, they pulled up 15 feet of dirt. Okay, the material for the new PNAS study came from the Camp Century, a Cold War military base dug inside of the ice sheets far above the Arctic Circle in the 1960s. So it's up farther north where it's even colder. Okay, the military mission failed, but the science team did complete important research, including drilling a 4,560-foot deep ice core. The extent of Greenland's ice sheets and what kinds of ecosystems existed there before the last interglacial warming period that ended about 120,000 years ago have been hotly debated and poorly understood. So we now know that they believe at 4,560 foot deep, once you get down, you get into where it's now dirt and there's plants growing and flowers and other different types of things, that they believe this is 120,000 years ago. Now, one last article I'm going to read, and then we're going to break all of this down. At least I think we are. Nope, actually 2 articles. My bad. All right. Scientists were stunned to discover plants beneath a mile deep of ice. That's the name of the study. And it says, the new study makes it clear that the deep ice at Camp Century, some 70 miles inland from the coast and only 800 miles from the North Pole, entirely melted at least once within the last million years and was covered with vegetation, including moss and perhaps even trees. The new research, supported by the National Science Foundation, lines up with the data from 2 other ice cores from the center of Greenland. So now, remember, they always trying to say, well, the center of Greenland is always more cold. So you have to exclude any of the evidence that you ever find around the shores. This refutes that because it concurs with exactly what's going on with the parameters. So remember that, because when you go and you try to look up arguments that refute this argument, you're only going to find 2 arguments, and one of them is that one. So, collected in the 1990s, sediments from the bottom of these cores also indicates that the ice sheet was gone for some time in the recent geological past. Okay, so they had to invoke that there was no ice in Greenland, and then the ice appeared. That's the number 1 key here. So, in the 1960s movie about Camp Century, right here, we're going to read the bottom. It's not highlighted, sorry. Created by the Army, the narrators note that more than 90% of Greenland is predominantly frozen under the polar ice cap. This study makes it clear that it's not as permanent as we once thought. Our study shows that Greenland is much more sensitive to natural climate warming than we used to think. And we already know that humanity's out of control warming of this planet hugely exceeds the natural rate. Okay, so they had to say now that the global warming now is also going to probably melt the ice in Greenland as it once did in the past. So they're now admitting that Greenland was not permanently ice, but that it has now become ice. So like I said, one last read, and then we get into this, an article called Ancient Leaves Preserved Under a Mile of Greenland's Ice. We read now that radiocarbon dating shows that it would have happened more than 50,000 years ago. It most likely happened during the time when the climate was warm and the sea levels were high, possibly 400,000 years ago. As we explored the soil under the microscope, we were stunned to discover the remains of tundra ecosystems. Remember, the tundra is they found twigs, leaves, and moss. And the other article stated that they might have been trees as well. But up that high, it also depends on latitude. Remember, you get above the tree line. That's called the tree line because you don't find trees above it. We don't know the altitude back then. We were looking at a northern Greenland as it existed the last time the reign of the was ice free. So this is great. They dug down, they found soil and an atmosphere that's underneath the ice that existed before there was ice. So now they can prove this, and it was like the tundra. So now here comes the dichotomy. We have a plain over 50 years, over 250 feet deep, and then how many layers would that be? According to geological time, this is based on how many feet it is. It would be akin to 135,000 years. If evolution was true, using the uniformitarianism processes that they use and invoke. This is why that I said in this article here, you can read that they now use radiocarbon dating because they can't rely on those dates anymore because they're finding conflicting information. So I'll read. If the present is the key to the past, then at the rate of 250 to 268 feet of snow per 50 years, 135,000 years equals 729,000 feet of snow. We obviously don't find that, so it's not true. When we factor in compression forces at greater depths, this gigantic glacier would still be several thousands of feet deep, thicker, or feet deeper than it is now. It is more likely then that the ice caps at their current depth formed much quicker than 135,000 years, getting closer to the time elapsed since the flood. Then what do we know? Well, I typed this in just yesterday. I typed, what is the snow like every day in Greenland? Well, it depends on the month. But check this out. 1 month in January, the average snowfall is 12.5 inches. That's 1 month out of the entire year. So can you get what's required when we break this down right here? Because I have the numbers. The plain was found 250 feet deep in 50 years. The soil that was found on the other side of the island was found at 4,560 feet deep. So you divide 250 by 4,560 and you get 18.424. Now you multiply this times 50 years and you get 912 years ago, there was no ice in the northern latitudes of Greenland. So that's 912 years ago. When did the Vikings discover it? Well, 985 AD or 1,035 years ago. That's when they landed there. Everything seems to line up, doesn't it? They landed, looked around, didn't see any ice. They said, this looks like good land. They settled there. They stayed until what's known as the mini ice age hit. That's when the ice rolled back into this area. And, well, as we know it rolled back in, we are assuming that it was ice before that and then melted and then iced again. So that's what we're getting at now. How can these ice core layers be millions of years old if they're admitting that it melted and then there's ice coming back into this area once again? So now we have the mini ice age hits around 1,300 AD through 1,850 AD. This means that for young Earth creation to be true, there needs to be 5 feet of snowfall per year for that to be true. Now, is that possible? Well, remember what I said right here. 1 month gets 12.5 inches. So that's over a foot in 1 month. Clearly, getting 5 feet of snowfall per year is not unreasonable for us to assume, considering that's what happens today. So if they want to use uniformitarianism processes to invoke what's happening today is key to the presence of the past, then they actually have to admit that young Earth creation is true based on what we're observing today. So this would mean that 1 ring per 5 feet every single year. The layers that were found over the plain were over 100,000. Now, 18,250 days in 50 years is how many days there are in that period, right? This means that 5 to 7 so-called annual layers would need to be forming per day for there to get over 100,000. Think about that. So that means there needs to be 5 to 7 different fluctuations of temperatures in a 24-hour period making those lines rather than them counting each of those lines as per year, as you can see on the bottom. So I wrote, ice core dating starts off with huge assumptions. One of those being that every ring is annual, as you can see here in the bottom. This is not true, as the rings can be formed based on temperature change. Since they view only summer and winter as time as this change, then this assumption leads to the problems that we now see. Many samples chemically gives young ages. This is why they invoke that gases can now diffuse through the fern, causing discrepancies in the ages that make them look younger than they are. So that's their rescue device. The gases that are in the frozen compacted layers of ice around these are throwing off young ages. That's the only reason it says that they're young. You need to ignore those, and you need to use the radionucleotides to get the true dates, right? Because those are the ones that give old ages. You need to ignore all those young ages, and you need to use the assumption ages of these radionucleotides. So that's what they've done. So here's a picture of them going through to that plane. Remember, look at this. This is an actual picture you can see of them going down to what they bored out and they cored to get to that plane. Look how far down that is. They went all the way down there to find that plane that was buried in just 50 years. And you can see the layers around him as he goes down. So I've been ignoring chat. Let me go check that out as you guys enjoy this picture. 5 feet, easy. Yeah, exactly. All of this can be easily answered, and I broke these numbers down so that you guys can have them, and you guys can use any of these slides. Obviously, you guys can use any of my work. I don't care. And I created this based on what they told us from their scientific journals and what we know about history. So we used natural meteorological data from the weather services of today based on how much snowfall we get in those regions, the temperature fluctuations that can happen throughout a day. We know when the Vikings arrived. We know when they left. We know what they documented as far as seeing snow, and we know that they left because of the snow. We know how long of a period. We know how much snow gathered over the plain in 50 years, and we know how much snow there was based on the soil that was found over almost a mile deep to the north. And we know that now the snow matches the perimeter in the center of the island because they admitted it. So ice core layering dating methods are completely falsified. You can throw it out the window along with every other trash argument they try to use to say that the earth is old. Game over, guys. That was my presentation. Go back to Donnie Standing for Truth channel. I hope you enjoyed. Now I can go eat.